Today's podcast is brought to you by Superior Culture Quality Brew Kombucha. They are a locally owned and operated organic beverage company. They are genuinely connected with the community and constantly striving to create flavors that you won't find anywhere else. I try to drink one of these every day because of the numerous health benefits I find. It eases my joint pain, it picks me up with energy, and it ensures healthy digestion. Superior Culture. Kombucha has changed our lives. What's up, guys? Welcome to Information Operation. I'm Connor Ryan, and we're coming at you from Marquette, Michigan, bringing you your locally sourced ideas, thoughts, and inquiries. Today on the podcast, we feature Chet DeFonso. He was born in New York and grew up in Kansas. He's been a Marquette local now for 27 years as the head associate professor of history at Northern Michigan University. He's an expert historian in British history from the 19th to 20th century, and his hobbies include travel, theater, and food. It was a real privilege to have this guy on the show. He really helps put history into perspective. So, without further ado, enjoy the podcast. Chet, thank you for being here today. Happy Easter.
Oh, thanks so much, Connor. It's a real pleasure to come down the street.
Definitely. I hope we can give people an introduction to history that is a little more dynamic and enjoyable for all walks of life.
That's one of the things I love talking about.
So, how did you first get introduced to history?
Wow, that is such a great question. I was someone who loved to read, and my parents had several different encyclopedias in the house. I loved to just pick up a letter at random and go from front to back. And I must have picked up H and got onto the history section of the World Book Encyclopedia and just got really interested in that. That was probably when I was 10 or 11. So history and I go back a long way. We've had a very long relationship.
So that was the spark.
I think so.
That's interesting.
Yeah, reading the encyclopedia.
Now,
It's been history ever since, huh?
Not history, it's still going on.
why do you think history is so important?
Well, history is a place where we come from, and it's a place where we store our memories. Some of them are good memories, some of them are difficult memories, but they're all part of our heritage. And they're the background of our present as well, and in some ways are the forecast of our future. So history is a gift. It's a gift from our antecedents, our ancestors, those who've gone before us.
That makes sense. What are your favorite aspects, really?
I like the way that history provides an opportunity to think about who you are, who your friends and relatives are in time. History is all about time
Right.
and the way that things exist, not just in a one-dimensional world, but in a multi-dimensional world that includes the element of change over time.
Right. In comparison, comparing oneself to others in time.
Right, exactly.
That's huge. I don't know why people find it so boring. You talk to a lot of people and they say, "Man, I hate history." It's like math or one of those, and I've never been that way. It's always been highly fascinating to me.
There's an important element of imagination in history that gets lost in schools where the emphasis is very often upon history as something to be memorized,
Yes.
a bundle of facts.
Rather than conceptualized.
What do you mean by there's imagination involved in history?
That history is not the past itself, but it's what we think about the past. So there are many histories. There's not a single history. There are multitudes of histories for events that existed in the past and stories that are told about that past.
Right.
So
Yeah, that's what my limited exposure to history in high school and stuff. It seems a lot of the people, they have this conception that history involves memorizing dates and actual events that happened, whereas you have a different, what I picked up from that answer is you have a little bit different look at it, which is interesting, where history isn't so black and white. There is some other aspects to it that go unnoticed by new students, or people just starting out in history, where they think, okay, got to memorize this date with this event
Mhm.
and these facts about it.
Well, this is certainly how we try to teach history at NMU, as something which is a field of investigation and exploration. We have a course called the Historian's Laboratory. Now, we don't actually dissect frogs in the historian's laboratory, but we do look at the tools that historians use that include old documents and
Yeah.
letters, as well as photographs and artifacts from the past.
So that goes as far as archaeological findings as well.
Absolutely,
Wow.
yes.
That's very
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
And when talking about that, do you know the actual origins of history? Like, when were people actually able to record history, the things that they were seeing?
Well, that human beings have been recording things since they've had the tools to do so. You
Okay.
go back to the cave paintings in various locations around the world, places like China and southern France and parts of Central and South America. People were making records of things that happened on the walls of the caves in which they dwelt. So, in a way, that's one form of history.
Right.
They also kept records of important people and spirits and changes in weather.
I remember talking also about the oracle bones that
Yeah,
recorded history in your class, and that was
yeah,
fascinating to me as well.
yeah. The thing is that history is changing as we develop new tools to understand aspects of the past. So that what I learned about history when I was in school back in the 1970s and 80s is part of history today, but it's only one part. And there's a lot of new history that's been
Discovered.
discovered and interpreted and told based upon new findings, like those oracle bones, or
Yeah.
like the current projects in archaeology, or underwater discoveries in Egypt or Greece.
And how does somebody from our world today learn how to decipher something like that from far, far beyond?
Oh, you get practice. You practice locally. You get experience working with local archaeologists here in the region, or in the general area of North Woods area, and then you apply what you learn in a national or international setting.
Hmm.
I have a current student, actually a former student of mine, pardon me, former student of mine, Heather, who is currently in Santorini in Greece working on an archaeological project
Wow.
of discoveries of Iron Age
Okay.
communities in
Ooh,
the.
that's probably pretty cool.
Oh, yes. It's not too bad to be in the Aegean at this time of the year either.
No, that's
Never visited. I'll take your word for it, though.
so you talked about some of the tools that allowed that to happen. What are some of the tools that allowed people to start living off the land as a civilization?
Well, the living off the land involved a whole set of skills. I suppose it depended too upon the availability of wildlife that was capable of being caught and then used for food or for implements, tools. Many people in many parts of the world relied primarily upon what they could forage in the forests or in the fields. And I think that generally those were the communities that did best,
Hmm.
because it was a lot harder to hunt and track down
Right.
animals than it was to pick up um, pieces of grain or nuts and berries
Right.
in the fields and in the woods.
Right. So that's when the innovation of farming really started to make a difference on how we lived as people.
One of the interesting questions that the archaeologists and early historians are dealing with right now is, what was the purpose of the first cultivation of grain? Was it to have more food for feasts to honor the gods? There's one school of archaeologists who believe that the purpose of cultivating grain was to help communities produce fermented beverages that provided enjoyment, pleasure, and an entryway into new psychological and mental states of mind.
Right. That's very
So
interesting.
maybe beer is the engine that propels societies forward.
I've never thought of it like that because me coming from the health industry, it's almost like now alcohol takes this, it gets a bad reputation for its
Mm-hmm.
health, you know, what is the word
Health
I'm looking
effects.
for? Yeah, the health
Doesn't.
effects.
Yes.
But it's been part of our culture since the beginning.
Every society has some kind of fermented beverage, and usually they're associated with feasting and with plenty, with celebrations of harvest, with honoring the spirits, the divine ancestors, the past.
That makes
So
sense.
it's a very important part of our being as humans. Actually, I'm teaching a course on food and culture for the honors program here at Northern, over at Northern,
Yeah.
and one of the books we're reading for this course deals with beer and its important role as an agent of change in history.
Right, and I think there's something to be said about that. Like, drinking and breaking bread together has always
Mm.
been the roots of our culture to come together and be a community.
Yes, feasting as something which provides a glue which bonds people together.
And how did like earlier civilizations do that? Like in the beginning of farming.
Well, they would have certain times of the year, usually associated with harvest, and then also with the very depth of winter, where they would make a special effort to provide bounty, extra portions, extra different kinds of food, in order to recognize the passages of time.
Gotcha. And what do you think was the main turning point where civilizations could then to grow?
Mm.
Past farming. What was the next step?
Probably I would say the development of languages and of storage facilities, whether they be intellectual storage facilities, forms of writing,
Right, like a library.
a library, yes.
Okay. How
So
did language come about? Do you know?
a language that's I really a bit far out of my wheelhouse.
Okay.
I'll have to pass to the linguists on questions relating to language. Professor David Bowie at NMU might have a few more intelligent things to say about that than I
Right.
could possibly.
Right. And when talking about resources, what about trading?
Yes, trading in commodities very important because different communities have different assets and the ability to provide extra surplus in one area while being able to take advantage of surpluses from other regions,
Yeah.
especially in areas where there's a lot of different environmental regions in a small area. So people at the top of the mountain have ability to have some assets, but need to trade with those who live at the bottom of the mountain.
Right, because they have resources that are not available to them, and they
Yes.
still need to get them.
And there's a very good reason why so many important civilizations developed along river routes, like Tigris and the Euphrates in
Hmm.
Mesopotamia, the Yellow River Basin in China, the Niger River in Africa.
Africa.
Rivers were the great highways of our world until the 20th century, really. Much easier to travel and transport things by water
Right.
than by over land.
So in all the different years and time spans and groups you've studied in history, what stands out as the most interesting? Do you have a favorite?
Well, I'm a modern historian, and I really enjoy teaching relatively recent history
Okay.
from the 18th century to the present. It's what we know of. It's what we know and we experience as 21st century Americans. We experience the intellectual culture that began to emerge at the time of the scientific revolution, Isaac Newton, and also the intellectual revolutions associated with the Enlightenment and the development of democracy and modern systems of education.
Right.
So I'm interested in how those systems and those institutions evolved over the last 200, 300
Probably
years.
because it seems that it kind of overflows into our life much greater. While
It
we still have roots back in time, but it really overflows, and we see the effects of all this scientific revolution, industrial revolution, and all those advancements in our society today.
It does. But there's a fascination with older histories. And I know many people, both younger people and older people, who are mesmerized and enraptured by the mystique of older times.
Hmm.
And it's all bountiful and wonderful.
But when talking about modern revolutions like that, how does that correlate with the hierarchy of needs?
Could you go on a little bit more about the hierarchy of
Yeah,
needs?
in psychology, the hierarchy of needs is basically a level system where people's first priority is going to be safety. Secondly, environment, natural disasters, wartime, things like that will infect or affect the level of environment. Then they have their emotional, or I'm sorry, the third level is community, having a sense of belonging. The fourth level is emotional, having a sense of understanding with oneself. And then the final level is self actualization, knowing one's purpose in life. And you can't reach the next level until you've fulfilled the bottom one, right? So people's hierarchy of needs in maybe third world countries, they're unable to reach an emotional state because they're still focused on having an environmental safety.
Mm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, in talking about modern history, how did we reach that level of philosophy or scientific revolution that Isaac Newton was able to find?
Well, there were a lot of factors that went into the development of modern science. Certainly, the development of trading systems with other parts of the world
Hmm.
provided Europeans with access to other forms of investigation, with some of the knowledge base that had been built up in the Arab Islamic world, for example. And it also provided urbanization and communities of wealth, which made it possible for universities like Cambridge University in England to
Okay.
flourish, where Isaac Newton made his home for most of his life.
And that's when real discoveries started happening in those fields.
In the European context, yes, but
Okay.
I think it was Newton himself who said that if he was able to view the stars, it was because he was standing on the shoulders of giants.
Right.
And he himself was particularly thinking of figures like Copernicus and Galileo, but they in turn were influenced by
Right.
earlier
Men
discoverers.
before them.
Yes.
And what allowed Europe that privilege?
I think it was a mastery of the seas, which gave Europe a real economic advantage over other regions of the world.
Yeah.
And it wasn't something which happened overnight. It was gradual. It was development of military technologies as well.
Hmm.
But even more importantly, I think it was a new interest in other parts of the world. Sometimes not for the most noble of reasons.
Right.
Sometimes generally it was for power and economic advantages at home.
That's super interesting to me how they dominated other parts of the world in places like Africa and parts of Asia and the Middle East.
Hmm.
And it seems like we see that today in those cultural differences.
The legacy of European colonization and imperialism is one that'll be around for a long time. If you go back further beyond the scientific revolution, the real areas of technological accomplishment in the world, say 1,000 years ago, were in China
Yeah.
and in the
Yes.
Arab world. Those areas, though, did not successfully compete with the Europeans once the Europeans started to develop their own assets, their own
Right.
intellectual and economic advantages in the 14th, 15th, 16th century. And the Europeans were eventually able to dominate and, in many places, to occupy
Yes.
parts of East Asia, Africa, certainly the Americas.
India, Africa, the big
Yeah.
ones.
Hmm.
So, do you have any insight into why they were not able to keep up, compared why they got outpaced by the other
That
communities?
that is the big question.
They had the resources. It
that
seemed like they had the
that
resources
is
to
the big
do
Yeah,
it.
question.
because technology advancements, I mean, it's kind of an exponential curve. Once you start advancing, you build off those advancements, and because you have the previous advancements and insights, your next advancement can be much greater, and that's how we see a lot of things in tech, in science.
Yes.
And
I
so, why did they get
I
outpaced?
have to say, in this area, I'm really speaking more as a student than I am as a faculty
Yeah.
member, because I did not study this topic in great depth when I
Hmm.
was in school as an undergraduate or in graduate school. But now I'm teaching this material. I'm responsible for teaching world history, and generally I teach the first semester, the history of the world up until the year 1520. And that's one of the big questions that we ask. It seems, say, for example, with China, that China reached a plateau of technology with the printing press, with gunpowder, with urban developments, with big
Silk.
ships,
I mean,
big sailing ships. But then they did not go beyond that plateau.
Could it be great minds? Did
And
they just not have the?
no, they certainly had great minds.
what is their number one priority in China?
The community and
Education.
education and sustaining the community. And they were not that interested in other parts of the world because
Okay.
China was and remains the center of the heavenly kingdom. And although there were the famous Chinese treasure fleets that reached Africa in the 1420s, they did not continue. And they were not terribly interested in developing permanent posts. No, they weren't interested at all in developing permanent posts outside of their own realm. So,
Interesting. And Europe definitely was.
uh, yes, certainly by the 15th, 16th century, the Europeans were rapacious and bloodthirsty and eager to spread their system of domination to other parts of the world.
Now, is this where the idea of racism kind of came about?
That is another excellent question. Racism, I think, is more modern, actually. I would say racism has its roots in modern science and the attempt to understand differences of culture. Racists, in the classical sense, believed that there were biological differences that explained different paces of cultural and historical development. They regarded themselves as scientific. So I think racism actually has its roots in the Enlightenment and in more recent Western history.
Okay.
I'm speaking about racism too in its more abstract and ideological sense,
Right.
not in the general sense of differences, one person or one group of people regarding themselves as better than others just because they're members of a different community, but
Right.
rather a belief that there were things such as races, and that they could be defined biologically and in terms of actual physical and physiological differences.
Right. And that's kind of the same idea as tribalism as well.
Yes.
And
Tribalism is very, very old, and tribalism is very much part of who we are as a species, I think.
do you think we're taking steps to move past that? This is an opinion-based question. Do you think we're now taking steps to move past that, or do you think we'll ever be able to?
Well, in some ways, technology it does provide a lot of opportunities to
Right.
move beyond tribalism. I mean, I can be in Marquette, Michigan, and I can easily communicate with people on the other side of the world, and I can learn from them too. That's my own personal example, but it
Right.
can be multiplied many, many times.
Yeah, and it's getting easier.
At the same time, technology also provides tools for tribalism to be deepened and further encouraged, because you can use the same tools of technology to foster a greater sense of commitment and attachment to your own particular group of people. So, if you look at some group like ISIS in the Middle East, they attempted to use technology as a way of encouraging others to join them in their own very tribalistic based policies. Not too successfully, but there's nothing to say there might be a more successful attempt to, again, in the future, to use modern tools of technology for similar purposes.
Right. So it's kind of on us,
That's how you use it, yeah.
Yes, that's the thing about technologies. The printing press can be used to produce pornography, or it can be used to produce cooking books and travel books and wonderful literature. Same thing with the interwebs.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Double-edged sword there.
Yes.
Powerful double-edged
The interwebs
sword.
can be used for podcasts.
Right. To spread information
And I
spread
know
ideas.
a lot of people do use it for good purposes.
Do you think humans, this might not, you might have some insight given your study of history in different groups, but Do you think humans are made to be in smaller tribes, will you say, versus being in a huge single tribe? You get the question I'm kind of
Like
Yeah,
Team
leading
Earth.
towards?
yeah. Well,
It almost seems humans are more made to be in smaller groups, smaller collective groups, which kind of promotes the idea of tribalism in
But I,
itself.
I like cities, and
Yeah,
some cities have thrived in the past. Um, it takes a lot in order to make a city succeed, but one of the things is the ability to get along with people different from yourself. And the environmental people, the people who study the world today, say that cities are actually a very practical way to live
interesting.
because the human beings in cities need less space, they consume less energy, they participate more in community-based activities, they share more, and that's actually better for the environment as a whole.
seems all good.
Yes. Um, it takes a lot of effort in order to create cities that are places where people want to live.
Doesn't
Yeah.
it also take a lot of time for humans? I mean, I feel like they're ever adaptive. Doesn't history show that humans have been able to adapt to new circumstances? It just takes a little bit of time for them to get comfortable with it.
That's the optimistic long-term frame view of history. The realist point of view of history looks at the legacy of people who have a harder time adapting to change, and the stories are not always very pleasant to tell.
What's an example of that?
Oh, I think maybe the stories of the, say, for example, the communities in Africa or Asia who didn't adapt to change at the time of European domination, and
Yeah.
as a result, their cultures suffered long periods of oppression,
Hmm.
and in some places near extermination because of their conquest.
Their inability to adapt.
Yes.
Now, it does seem like Africa did have a lot of resources. I remember you talking about the gold that
Hmm.
was in Africa. Now, how did they exploit those resources how did the British Empire or the colonialists exploit those resources?
Well, the most important resources in Africa were mineral resources, but there were also food items as well, nuts, palm oil from West Africa, and then later rubber and ivory. So your African resources were first developed in areas close to the coast.
Yeah.
Of course, even before then, the slaves as a resource
Yeah.
had been exploited as well. But those were usually obtained through internal African trades, which brought the slaves to
The coast.
coastal markets.
Or the Gold Coast.
Yes, the so-called Gold Coast. Yeah. So Europeans actually were relatively late in coming to the interior of Africa. Only the mid to late 19th century is when the main wave of
Okay.
European exploration occurred then. And in some ways, that was made possible by medical advances like quinine
Okay.
and the development of other drugs which made malaria less of a severe threat
For intruders.
for intruders into
Invaders.
Africa. Yeah. There's a wonderful historian who just died maybe a month ago. His name was Alfred Crosby, and he wrote a book called Ecological Imperialism. And he wrote about the way in which different continents, different environments of the world foster, or in some cases repelled, outside intervention. Africa was a place which repelled outside intervention for
Nice.
many, many centuries because of the rather unique and special circumstances of African insect life, African plant life,
Hmm.
just the enormity of Africa. It made it very, very difficult for Europeans to penetrate Africa in the same way that they had in the Americas.
That's crazy to think about when you go back to the days of the Europeans. They don't know what's on this continent, but they're gonna go find out. And that first expedition
Hmm.
team that goes and tries to gather as much information as they can.
Nate's just thinking about tigers right now. He's
The
terrified.
dark continent, some of the things that you
Yeah.
related to insects, the wildlife,
You know.
the environment, that environmental
Hmm.
aspects they had to go through. That is so different than Europe.
Yes.
Just
Also,
night and day.
in terms of the suitability of the interior of Africa for the cultivation of European style crops, the Americas proved to be, well, especially North America, proved to be very ideal for the cultivation of grain. The
Yes. Corn.
amber waves of grain um, really support and sustain a large population in the North American continent.
Yeah.
Same is holds true for Australia as well. Suitability of European style agriculture in Australia means that now I'm drinking Australian wines and enjoying them. But Africa does not have the landmass
Right. So it's
type
very
for
thick.
it, or the particular biota which supports or sustains that kind of agriculture.
Gotcha. And just so I'm kind of on the same page, for a timeline standpoint, where was the colonialism when it comes to Africa, India, Japan, China? Like, at one point, the sun never set on the British Empire.
Yes. Yeah.
So, timeline-wise, how did that happen?
India was perhaps earlier
Okay.
because of the importance of Indian spices and silver in its trading networks. So the British started to get involved in India in the 1600s. China, somewhat later, and that was originally out of their interest in India. They developed interest in China for tea and also for silver. And then Africa was last.
Okay. And it seems you were saying that Africa was very conceited or concealed. They didn't want any kind of inward, or they didn't want any kind of cultural, invasions. Japan was the same way, correct?
Yes, Japan was remarkably successful in.
How did they differ from Africa, even though they had the same um, idea or mentality about that?
Japan had a uniquely strong military culture based on the samurai, for one thing. Japan was self-sufficient economically, and the Japanese cut themselves off from most other contacts with non-Japanese culture sometime around the year 1400. And they worked very hard and strong to preserve that cultural independence. You could say they're still do so to some degree even today, in the sense of their Japanese pride in being a distinct and different culture.
Now, what role would you say religion played in Europeans' dominance of the rest of the world?
I think actually it was a motive to Europeans because the European mentality came to believe their actions as being justified by Christian dogma,
Right.
Christian sense of responsibility of carrying the Christian message to other parts of the world. So it was a motive more than it was a cause. If that makes sense, it was something that
Right.
gave the Europeans a sense of mission, but it wouldn't have been a sufficient cause unto itself.
I gotcha. And how did the idea of Eastern mysticism come about?
I think that came about through the European Enlightenment, and it came about through a European understanding of the distinctive nature of Eastern philosophies
Yeah.
and Eastern religions, specifically Buddhism
Hmm.
and Hinduism, as being very fundamentally different from monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, or even Islam.
Right. And do we still experience the effects of that today?
The division between um, different worlds of thought, I think so. I think there is particularly among Westerners now difficulty of perceiving the essence of Hinduism,
Yeah.
which may not even have an essence in the same way that other faiths do.
And how is that just left out?
Hinduism?
Yeah, like what is not taught in your typical history class?
Well, we have a limited amount of time, so we can't cover as much as perhaps we should. Certainly, I think India sometimes gets neglected. In part, what I teach in world history is a reflection of what I understand will be tested. Many of the students who take the course, probably a majority, are in the secondary education program, and they will at some point be taking the standardized test for future educators, and they will be tested on matters related to world history. From what I understand, the history of China is a very strong emphasis. So I do try to prepare students with a broad background in Chinese history. From what I understand, India is a less significant topic, so I don't cover India in the same way, in the same depth that I do China. I will admit I do tailor my course to some degree to what the students will be tested on. I think that's really part of my job to help prepare our students to go through all the hoops that they need to in order to become good future educators.
Absolutely. And I noticed that in like high school history as well, it was even more narrow.
Yes.
You know, the scope was even more narrow.
But that may have also been because your educators, your teachers in high school were probably not prepared. They were probably not taught when they were in school. So they themselves would be unfamiliar with world history.
That's interesting because that's our educational system.
It is. It takes a generation for changes to work their way through in education, because actually there are things you pick up. You do become better as an educator the more you do it, but what you learned as far as content, subject matter, there's a lot of changes that go on from decade to decade. So what I constantly tell my students is what I'm teaching you now, I've learned in the last decade, because I all of this is new to me. It didn't exist as knowledge when I was in school. That's what's important to get across to students, that history is not set in stone or books that were published 30 years ago. History is being made, is being created, is being discovered today. And so what the students are learning in world history, a lot of it is work that's been done in the last decade.
Wow.
So I have a lot of work to do to keep up on what's going on.
That's awesome.
That's one of the things I like about my job at Northern, is that I'm teaching things that I am learning. I'm not just teaching what I learned already 30 years ago.
Right.
I mean, I could do that, but and I do some of it, but it's also exciting to be a learner as well as an educator.
That's beautiful. Forever a student to the craft. I think that's important with anything.
I like that. That's a good phrase.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I try to live by that.
Yeah.
Do you see a main difference in our education system as compared to the rest of the world?
Well, we don't really have an education system. We're a very big country, and there are a lot of different niches and a lot of different ways to be educated in the U.S.
Yeah.
So, I don't think there's any real mind, or there's a controlling influence on education in the United States. So there's enormous differences. We see that even at a place like NMU at Northern, where almost all of our students come from Michigan or Wisconsin. There's enormous difference based upon school district, based upon whether a student has been home educated or not, whether they're from a big school district or a small school district, whether they've had good teachers or not so good teachers.
Right. But that in itself is a system, correct?
It's a system that's not systematic. So it's one of the challenges of teaching, especially introductory courses, at an institution like NMU. Just because a student is a freshman doesn't mean that there's anything that they know.
Right.
You can't assume anything, and that's a challenge.
Yeah.
I have some students who are freshmen who are would be ready to talk at a complex level. Most of the students are not. So
Right.
I I I don't teach for the best students. I teach for the median.
Gotcha. And that being said, do you see a major difference in how school systems are worked in other parts of the world? Like,
Well,
in particular, Asia. That's kind of fascinating to me how they do it drastically different than
yes, they
us.
do. There's a lot more. There's a lot more being put into a certain route at an early age. You're given an exam. The way that you perform on that exam will determine your track
Mm-hmm.
through your future education. You'll be given a number, and that number will determine your life. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of more um, high stakes testing in
Yeah.
Asia. I don't think it's very healthy for an individual.
Okay. So, what kind of culture? Do you have a question?
No, I was just that seems so awful. Seems so awful.
What kind of cultural effects does that have?
Well, it encourages a lot of young people to believe in the necessity to conform to the standards that their elders have put upon them. It does lead to a lot of anxiety and depression and suicide in certain cultures, in certain
And it
places.
seems like it would lead to a lot of all-around life unhappiness. I mean, if you're skilled at something but it's not your passion, but you're stuck doing that for life, that's a tough pill to swallow.
But it is part of a culture which emphasizes the community
Yeah.
and the culture
Yeah.
and not
One's
the
role.
and not the
Yeah, that's very
individual.
true.
So
So they might pull the happiness from knowing that. Yeah,
yes,
that's very true.
yes. But we don't have that culture either.
No,
So
not at all.
That's interesting. I kind of want to shift gears towards America because we covered kind of European dominance in the 19th century, 18th
hmm
century. How did the power then transfer to America, and why did people want to come here?
well, okay. So there are a couple questions there.
Yes.
First, about the rise in power in the United States, and I think that a lot of that was the potential was present from the beginning because of the application of military power to expansion in the United States, and the fact that the United States was expansionary from the very get-go. I've learned a lot being here in the Upper Peninsula in the last few years from our indigenous neighbors, from
Mm-hmm.
the Native American and
Mm-hmm.
Anishinaabe community, and the United States was involved in imperial expansion, and even before that, the British and French and Spanish empires were expansionary as well. So there was already a motor or a system of conquest and domination
Right.
from the very
That's
beginning.
kind of the mode of operation
Yes.
in our framework.
In the genetic, in the metaphorical genetics, DNA structure of who we are. I think also in terms of population and economic base, there was a successful implantation of a European style
Yep.
of
Yep.
economic development.
I do want to get into that. Before we get too into that, do you know anything about true Native Americans? Like, how did they get here? Was there an ice bridge? Did
No,
they
I'm
come
not.
from South
I'm not going to
America?
go that.
That's
I
a
don't.
speculation.
Well, I don't have enough knowledge base for that
Okay.
to comment intelligently on that. So
Okay. That's fine.
it's outside of my area.
Okay. No problem. Let's talk about the immigration. What brought people to America?
Well, they're both push factors and they're pull factors.
Yeah.
That's how we historians talk about it. Push factors relate to economic, usually, sometimes social or political causes.
Right.
And there were major push factors in the 19th century that involved economic changes, urbanization, especially changes in agriculture,
Yeah.
which meant that there was less need for a large agricultural population. And so there were a lot of people who were looking for opportunities to have a different life and their old ways of life were no longer sustainable. So,
Like, what do you mean by that? What was so bad about Europe during that time where the push factors were relevant?
well, with changes in agricultural technology, fewer people were needed to harvest the grain or
Okay.
to plant the crops. There was a lot of migration to cities. Cities were very dangerous, filthy, unhealthy places. And the United States, Canada, South America, those all were places that seemed to offer health,
Okay.
better economic prospects, and a new beginning. The rapid pace of change in Europe meant that many people were looking for a new beginning, and emigration from Europe seemed to provide that opportunity that they really desperately wanted. I'm thinking of my own ancestry. My Italian grandparents were, especially my Italian grandfather, was motivated by agricultural depression
Yeah.
where he was.
And I think the same was apparent for my family. From Ireland,
Yes.
the potato farms had become industrialized.
Yes, and the horrible example of the potato famine in Ireland demonstrated the failure of monocrop agriculture.
Gotcha.
And then, of course, in Ireland too, the political factors involved as well.
And what kind of opportunities were available in America?
Opportunities to live on and work on the land. I know many of the immigrants were particularly in this part of the country attracted to the ideals that they had of open spaces of land that they could cultivate, of
Yeah.
forests that they could work on. Whether they were really given a fair understanding of the difficulties that they'd face or not, that's a good question. But I think they perceived at the time that there were a lot of opportunities that existed in the open spaces in their minds,
Right.
open spaces that were made possible through the military
Yeah.
conquests of
The whole country.
the whole country, the whole
Because
space.
they landed in the east.
Hmm.
What were cities like New York and port cities like when we first landed here?
They were very unpleasant places. They were very dirty. There was a lot of danger of disease in those places, and it was a good idea to get out of them as quickly as you could.
Places like Boston.
Boston, Halifax, Canada, Montreal. A lot of people who settled this part of the country came down the St. Lawrence,
Okay.
and they came through Detroit, and then on up.
French.
French or English, Scottish, Irish. Yes, the St. Lawrence was a major, as I was talking earlier, the importance of rivers. The St. Lawrence was a very major river that was significant in the development, not just of Canada, but also of the interior of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So the diseases that people faced in the new cities, New York, the ones that were first inhabited, was that more due to the uncleanliness, or was
Yes.
it more due to a new continent and
No,
new?
overcrowding, lack of sanitation, too many people, not enough toilets, um, and festering of vermin, unpleasant insects and rats and
Yeah.
yeah, things that we might not think of as being typical of North America, but also things like typhus and typhoid,
Yeah.
yellow fever. Those were also epidemic in North America in the 19th century.
Not only for us, but the Native Americans as well,
Yes.
because we
Yeah.
brought it over.
Yes.
Okay. And have you seen? I want to talk about two movies.
Okay.
They tried to depict that in Kings of New York.
Oh yeah, the Martin Scorsese film.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that film.
They did a pretty good job with the uncleanliness
Yes,
and
the grittiness of
gritty.
the Irish and how they were oppressed and
Yeah.
not really welcome.
Right. And
Daniel
then
Day-Lewis. Yeah.
Killer Leonardo DiCaprio.
Now, is that the movie you showed me at my house, Kings of New York?
No.
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 What was that?
I don't know.
What's Kings of New York? About the kind of
It's the
animosity.
gangs of New York, not Kings of New York.
Okay.
Okay, that is the one you showed me.
Yeah.
And that kind of stuff was happening in real life.
Oh
in
yeah,
this
oh
new...
yeah, yeah.
Big time.
That movie's based on a couple history books, and
Really?
Martin Scorsese really loves his history, and he loves his New York.
So
So
you think it was a good depiction?
I think it was very well done.
Accurate.
That's unbelievable.
And
I did see that movie. I didn't know it was that kind of that level of animosity
Now,
and
I think-
violence was I mean, it's not super accurate, but and I know I'm not. You got to take it with a grain of salt, but
Well, I wouldn't take it with a grain of salt. I mean, the background of the film is the history of the time. It is a
exploitation.
beautiful, violent rendition of that time in history, but it's definitely based on things that really happened. The riots of New York and the animosity between different immigrant groups and the racism, well, or high degree of prejudice and discrimination
Right.
that they faced from other Americans who were already there.
Right. And moving from east to west, the second movie I'd like to talk about is The Revenant.
No, I did not see that.
Did not see
No.
The
no,
Revenant.
that
It's-
one's a good one.
No.
It's about the pioneers
Okay.
It's a
moving
real good
from
one.
east to west, and I just cannot imagine the circumstances exploring places like Colorado and the Rocky Mountains,
Mm.
and exploring places in Canada
Mm-hmm.
near the Yukon and things like that. Just completely uncharted territory.
Oh, is that also Leonardo DiCaprio?
It is.
Okay.
It is.
That's a really good movie.
But how long did it take to conquer that? What kind of resources did it take to conquer that part of America? It seems so volatile almost.
Well, I don't think it was done
Harsh.
all at once, and
No. And then
Small incremental steps. I mean, given the resources that they did have to cover that kind of terrain and that kind of weather and just all the adversity they would have to face to cover that kind of land.
I mean, they were doing this with fur,
mm-hmm.
and they were doing this while facing,
Native
Native
Americans and
Americans and bears and things like that.
I just read a book about Napoleon, actually, and the circumstances behind the Louisiana Purchase. That interesting that it was kind of a secondary thought. Napoleon really wasn't thinking very seriously, very deeply about when he decided that, oh, the Louisiana wasn't really necessary for France, and he needed a little bit of revenue, so he kind of let America, the United States, have that enormous amount of land for not very much money. It was
Yeah.
one of the great bargains of history.
Yeah.
It probably would have eventually come to the United States sooner or later, but just at one quick economic deal, the United States more than tripled its size,
Right.
and all that land.
Because it was harsh, it seems.
It was regarded as harsh. Yeah.
Okay.
was the west end of the Louisiana Purchase even explored at the time of that deal?
I think there may have been some prior
Speculation.
investigation, but primarily it would have been utilized, if any, by the Europeans for
Okay.
the fur trading.
Gotcha. And that was predominantly done by the French.
Yes.
I know this is going a little bit more broad, but what are the main differences that you see culturally between the developed United States and Europe?
Well, I think there are both differences and similarities. I think that things in Europe do tend to be older, and I think that Europe has been also very much affected by the wars that have really torn across Europe in the 20th century, a much more profound influence by the world wars. I'm teaching a course this semester on World War One, and students are asking me to develop a course on World War Two as well. I think those had a very profound influence on the way that Europeans lead their lives still today.
Yeah.
They've led to a opposition to a lot of aspects of militarism or of nationalism that don't exist to the same degree in the United States.
Right.
Also, Europe has a different relationship with socialism than we do in the United States, and most European countries have adopted some form of socialized economic development in a way that hasn't really come to be in the United States. So that's a very profound difference as well.
Wow.
There are a lot of similarities culturally, and you can see that in the way that popular music and films travel very well between, say, the United States and Germany.
Right.
So they're both differences and similarities.
That's like super interesting how you say that it changed their attitude towards militarism in I think that's very apparent in the way that we operate, in the way
Mm.
that we do, places like the Middle East and the way that we see that compared
Hmm.
to the way that Europe does.
Yes.
Um, Now, world wars, we didn't really have any kind of home front situations with world wars besides Pearl Harbor, correct?
Yes, if you're talking about a direct attack upon territory, there was a naval blockade, and there were some shipping incidents, German submarines attacking American
Hmm.
ships during both wars, and the Japanese did launch several balloon attacks,
Okay.
attempting to use balloons. I remember reading once about balloons balloons that were used in an attack on the Oregon coast in the 1940s. Very
Interesting.
small scale compared to the mass bombings in Europe or Japan.
Right. And I understand that you do like a lot of traveling.
I That's my real passion for pastime and hobby. Yeah.
So you've traveled to Europe how many times?
Oh, I can't tell you. It's a lot.
That's a lot. And
I grew up in an airline family. Both of my parents worked for the airlines.
okay.
My father was a lifelong employee of well, it was TWA, Trans World Airlines.
Okay.
I had a free flight pass until I turned 23,
Wow, that's
and
awesome.
I used that. I used that baby.
How did you how would you compare learning about the history of Europe in the classroom to actually going there and seeing it?
It's like anything. It's a difference between book learning and experiential learning.
Hmm.
There's a real understanding that comes from actually seeing and smelling and hearing. Maybe with virtual reality, we'll be able to simulate the experience of travel.
That
I
would be interesting.
Without the difficulties of TSA and
Yeah,
lost
right.
bags. In the interim, travel is really a wonderful way of experiencing other parts of the world.
Where's got to be your favorite place that you've traveled so
Well,
far in your life?
I enjoy a lot of places. I'd say the most beautiful place I've ever been is the northern fjords of Norway.
Hmm.
They're just stunningly beautiful, and it's so far north. I did have the good experience of being up there above the Arctic Circle on June 21st, and the odd experience of seeing the sun never set. Actually, being outdoors at a bar at midnight, and then a couple hours later, the sun was actually further east than it had been at midnight. And it's a little bit disconcerting because we do tend to think that the sun moves from east to west,
Right.
and you're out on the porch, out on the deck, drinking a beer, and a couple hours pass, and the sun has actually moved from the west to the east. It's
All perspective.
Yeah.
Everyone's got different perspective.
So what do you get out of traveling that you cannot achieve in the classroom or the book?
What you get out of traveling is, I think, it's a it's a kinetic and it's a physical experience that where the learning becomes part of your physiology. I really do believe that there's a lot of importance to um, that extra sense. And the brain it's a remarkably complex organism. So it's another layer or another set of connections that enhances the overall learning experience.
Yeah.
I tell my students that they should, if they really want to learn something, they should increase the exposure with several different forms of learning.
Right.
Just because, from what we know about the brain, the more areas of the brain that you activate, the more connections you form, and the deeper the experience is.
Would you say that has something to do with being able to connect with your surroundings by talking to people and interacting with that environment?
Yeah, probably also the additional senses,
The food.
the food, the smells, the sights, the sounds, and that other sense of being somewhere, which I don't know if that's a if that is an actual sense, but I think there's a real sense that you get in a certain place.
Is that completely, yeah, it's completely irreplaceable. What kind of learning is that? Experiential?
It's related to experiential learning.
And what are the different types of learning?
Well, there's learning by reading, there's learning by listening, there's learning by watching a series of images. Um, there's learning by doing something with your hands. There's learning by taking part in a group activity.
Okay. So all the senses plus
Hmm.
others.
Yes.
Interesting.
That I'd like to have different forms of learning in a single class. I think it's a good
Yes,
strategy.
especially when you kind of touched on it in terms of their level of knowledge, but
Hmm.
also every kid in your class learns in a different way. They all
Right.
connect differently. So
Right.
definitely, I've had teachers that you go in for a whole semester and you're gonna listen to them talk every day.
Hmm.
Just it'll work for some, but there's others where you lose them quick.
Hmm.
So do you think we're embarking on a new style or new format of learning in the near future?
I think we'll probably always be um, finding new tools in our kit boxes and getting them out, polishing them, using them, and then in a few years, someone will come out and say, "Oh no, you should definitely not rely too much upon that particular tool. You need to use other tools in your kit box." We've got a lot of tweaking to do.
Along that same line, it's so interesting. In the past, I couldn't even say how long it's been, but I'd say in the last 5 years, it's really come about. Is all the free content that's released,
Yes.
given the age of the internet and the different advancements on the internet, where high level schools like Stanford and
Hmm.
MIT are releasing so many different kind of courses. I mean, there's history courses, there's English courses, there's tech courses.
I love YouTube.
Yeah, yeah,
I can't
right.
imagine not being able to use YouTube in my classes. I find that to be a very exciting tool. There's so much material out there now that's easily accessible. It's a remarkable bounty.
I remember my first, I don't know what year it was, but some girl in my class told me about YouTube way back when. I don't even know what year this was, what grade I was. She told me about YouTube. I was like, "What's YouTube?" So I go back that night and I'm trying to find YouTube on the internet, and search
Hmm.
engines aren't very powerful around those days. So I'm typing in the letter U with
Mm-hmm.
tube, and I'm not
Mm-hmm.
finding
Hmm.
anything.
I don't think YouTube is that really that old. I think
No,
it's
2006 or
yeah,
so. It might even be later than that.
yeah. That sounds about right.
It's recent.
Yeah.
The internet itself is very recent, and
Right.
Well, the internet's been around, but as far as the commercial use, World
yes,
Wide
yeah,
Web is about less than 30 years,
yeah,
25.
yeah.
Now, when you started teaching, it was non-existent.
That's right. Yeah.
So how did that change the game?
Well, it's like other things. You have to be a lifelong learner in order to be a lifelong teacher, because what we try to do with our students today in preparing them for education, working in education, it's not to give them all the answers, but to give them a good set of questions, and then they'll be responsible for um, learning and teaching and evolving themselves. I think that's pretty much a model for everything that the university should do today, because
Hmm.
the questions that we have today are are not going to be the questions that are going to be asked in 15 years. And to think that we should only prepare students for a job today, I think that's really shortchanging our students. It's not fulfilling our responsibility as an institution.
Goes back to the lifelong saying of teaching the man to fish instead of giving him the fish.
Yes.
So what do we prepare students to do?
To think critically about the world, and also to think critically about themselves, and to be interested. I don't think you can teach people to be interested in the world, but you can suggest ways in which it's a good thing, and you can model good behaviors and good ways of approaching the world.
Before we wrap up, what advice would you give somebody who's seeking that type of learning?
Travel.
Yeah.
Travel and experience and curiosity. Just stay curious about a lot of different things.
Open-minded.
Yeah. Well, open-minded, but also interested in relating what you have and where you come from. Interested in your own immediate circle. So not rejecting automatically where you come from, but understanding that you are the result of a long heritage, and that you have a responsibility, or you have a responsibility to your own heritage and to the world in which you live.
I love it, Chet.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here
Oh, you're
today.
welcome. You're welcome.
Have a wonderful Easter.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been great.
We will be on YouTube and iTunes.
Good.
It's good talking to you, Chet.
Good to talk to you.
Interesting
Nice to meet
stuff.
you, Nate.
Yeah, it's to you.
Until next time, guys. Ride the waves, dude.